Hello, everybody. Welcome to a brand new episode of the Flyers Daily Podcast, one that is doing a rare feat of being live streamed, as Brian Bourne is just calling me. Oh, boy. Bad timing, Borny. But anyway, it is Jason Martinez. It is Bill Meltzer from PhiladelphiaFlyers.com, NHL.com, and HockeyBuzz.com. It is my broadcast partner on the Flyers pregame, intermission, and postgame show, Brian Smith. And ho-hum, nothing to talk about here. Just the naming of the president of hockey operations and Keith Jones, the interim tag removed from Danny Briere. Pretty big day here, Billy.
No, for sure. There were a zillion rumors, leading up to this. It's going to be really, really interesting to see how the management structure is going to fit together. I think that one of the biggest reasons why Jonesy was hired is that it's going to be, from all indications, a non-traditional kind of arrangement. You're not going to have the president/president of hockey ops working over the GM and the coach working under the GM. It's going to kind of be a bilateral structure. So it's going to be a collaborative thing with all three guys working together. And it's not the norm in the NHL. Some teams have kind of tinkered with the structure a little bit, but really it's there's not a lot of track record of this. Obviously, Jonesy's in management for the first time. Danny's a first-time GM. So there's not a track record to base it on. You're basing it upon the individuals involved and their knowledge base in the game, of which I say that all three passed that test. But in terms of how it all fit together and how it'll work together, I mean, that remains to be seen, because that's really first time doing it.
Right. This is a unique situation. You're with the team, and, I know you guys are spread out a little bit. You've been cleaning out the office and getting ready things for some renovations, but what's it been like around the team through this process of, they move on from Chuck Fletcher, but, now you have Danny with the interim tag removed and Jonesy hired. And I mean, just a lot of crazy happenings of late.
Yeah, I got to be honest with you. It's been pretty quiet just in terms of, actual information flying around. There was it was kind of interesting for me yesterday. I was actually out of town. I was down in Virginia moving my son out of college, and about 11:30 in the morning was the first time I heard Jonesy's name mentioned at all. I think I had seen probably the same thing as a lot of you guys had seen. The names that had come and gone across the last couple of weeks, and got in the car, drove 6 hours home roughly, and by the time I got home, it was everywhere. So it was really kind of interesting the way it all played out. But it had been kind of hinted, I think, by some of the folks that were keeping an eye on this, that be ready for a off the radar name maybe coming into this, yeah. And that's certainly what we got. But I think we got it in a good way. And to your point about non-traditional management structures and things like that, I think it definitely is going to be a kind of a new look here, and that you really haven't seen around the league before. And Jason, you and I have talked about it in the past during games, that even the whole concept of a president of hockey ops over top of a general manager is relatively new in the NHL, and it's something that really the Flyers only ever had once when Paul Holmgren was the president and Ron Hextall was the GM, and then when Chuck Fletcher came in, he had both roles again. But when you look at how we have to operate around here on a day-to-day basis, I mean, the NHL has gotten to be such a big business that you need this sort of structure really to handle the day-to-day workload. Being a general manager of an NHL team is a huge enough job in this day and age. Communicating with the business side of things and being on the same page with everything going on across the whole organization is a whole second job in and of itself. And that's why these president roles have started to come through. And that's where I think they're looking for somebody like Jonesy and his skill set, just his interpersonal relationships with people, number one, his contacts around the league being number two. And, the fact that really he hasn't been in hockey management, ever in an official role. He's been more on the business side, as a broadcaster and stuff. So he knows what goes into things like that, and it's going to be, very, very helpful in linking those two together here. So, that's kind of where it's headed, I think, and it's going to be a bit of a new way of doing things. But hey, that's something that this team has in its history. First assistant coach and video coaching, early adopters of that, all that sort of thing. So it fits right in with the team's history here.
Bill, one of the things in today's NHL, you have 32 teams, and teams that are able to really be Stanley Cup contenders and teams with cup contenders that are, have some staying power and can do it for a long time. You have to build an entire roster. The draft lottery was this week, which we talked about the other day. And obviously they end up with the 7th pick. They don't move up for Connor Bedard. And you look at, the fact that since 1980, only 10 players that were drafted number 1 overall have actually won a cup. But, the fact of the matter is this has to really, 3 boxes need to be checked, and they all are of equal importance. Number 1, the players on the ice, the team construction of what you see on the field of play. Players got to fit. You got to have skill. You got to have depth. Got to have goaltending. Got to have a little luck along the way as well. Then you have the other element of culture and professionalism, how those guys interact off the ice, amongst themselves, on the road, and all of those. And then you have the fiscal puzzle, which is the financial element in the salary cap world, that's got to fit as well. So all 3 of these, if you have a weakness in any of them, Bill, you don't have much of a shot in today's NHL.
No, for sure. And your management has to be pulling the rope in the same direction. That was one of my reservations. When the management structure was proposed, if you bring in someone who's been a long time general manager, he's used to doing things a certain way. And if you have someone else with a GM title, and you have a head coach that has significant influence on the where they're going to go in the personnel and the roster building side. If they're butting heads and getting each other's lane all the time, and there's no collaboration between the 3, you're going nowhere in a hurry. And I don't know if this is going to work or not work, but I did have reservations, in terms of, well, if you bring in and I mentioned the name Brian Burke, not out of disrespect to Berkey, but just because he's a guy who's used to getting his way and doing things a certain way. Lou Lamoriello was used to doing things his way, a certain way. And, if you're sharing power among 3 people, if it's somebody like that you're bringing in, I don't know if that would have worked. And then remains to be seen if this will work. But I think those 3 areas, you've hit the nail on the head. You're building a roster, you're managing a salary cap, right? And you have to be pulling the rope in the same direction. One thing that I can say going into this is that there's an immediate comfort and familiarity among the 3 big names. And that's that's pretty big at the beginning stages. We'll see how it develops over time. Again, we're going to judge it based upon what the results are on the ice after 1 season, after 2 seasons. I think you need to have a little bit of patience on the front end, and then and then be objective going forward as to, okay, what's working, what can still get better.
Brian, one of the things the president of hockey operations, I think that we'll find out tomorrow, is kind of defining the role. When Chuck Fletcher had it and he had both, I always thought that if a GM was also the president, he was compromised in a way where, a GM can't have to always be worried about butts and seats. He's got to build this the right way without being leaned on in those fashions. We don't know exactly what this role means for Jonesy. Had it been Doug Wilson or a former GM that was hired, I think we'd feel like it was a different role. But really, what we need to find out next is what is the structure and what is Keith Jones' responsibility in all of this. And I think he'll articulate that tomorrow.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting a little bit of clarification on that myself, just in terms of, okay, who reports to who here, and then what's the primary focus for everybody, and in the way this is going to be all set up. I will say this just in terms of what somebody like Jonesy brings to a traditional hockey operations president role is probably a unique knowledge of players around the league. And the reason I say that is because in his role as a national analyst, he is constantly getting on the inside of other organizations just from the standpoint of that's how broadcasting works in the NHL. You as a broadcaster are afforded access to coaches in particular, but also some management people that you would not get as even a scout. I mean, you don't have a scout going downstairs before a game to talk with the head coach about his team. It just you don't get that in that role. So Jonesy has had a chance to build that kind of knowledge on every player in the league. So he'll be able to at least offer his opinions on guys. With Danny apparently being in charge of all of the hockey decisions, he'll be able to to kind of give his opinion based on what he's seen. Now, on the other side of the coin, there, the other roles and stuff that he'll kind of contribute to, again, the familiarity is big for me. The fact that you're not bringing in somebody who doesn't know anybody in the entire organization and has to take several months to a year to get to know the personnel and things like that. I mean, it can be tricky around here just in terms of figuring out who to call if you need a light bulb change. This is a pretty big building, and it's a pretty big staff, and you see a light bulb out. Oh, well, how do we get that fixed? He already has so much familiarity with the people that run this organization, that run this building, that he'll be able to jump right in and help with those parts of the business as well.
And something else I'll add to that too, Brian, is that this isn't unprecedented with somebody moving from the booth to a management role. Look at John Davidson, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Spent many years broadcasting before he moved over the management side, or people just moving from playing directly into management. It's been a while now since Danny played, but Danny kind of apprenticed on the management side and then moved into management. But I kind of look around the league, and Steve Yzerman retired and then immediately became vice president of hockey ops for Detroit, right? And then had his first GM opportunity by going to Tampa. Or Joe Sakic moved pretty quickly from playing to managing, and then there was a gap in the case of Cam Neely between playing and managing, but he went right to being towards the head of hockey ops in Boston, without a ton of run up experience scouting and building up to that. So it's not unprecedented, and there's no question about Jonesy's how many people he knows around the game and the access that he's had. It's just a question of how it fits together to me.
Yeah, I mean, you see it in all sports. Guys that are analysts on TV go back in. Rick Tocchet was an analyst on TNT. He's now coaching the Vancouver Canucks. You see it, in the NBA. Doug Collins did it in the NBA. Was a coach for a long time, became a broadcaster and analyst, and then went back to coaching. So that part's not that uncommon. And then the other thing too, Bill, you look around the league, and I was looking at the list of NHL GMs right now, and there are a lot of first-time GMs, whether it's Rob Blake or guys like Bill Guerin, who was a player, is now a GM. Chris Drury, they all had some apprenticeship as well to get to where they are. And, there's a lot of younger guys in the game right now because the game has changed. And the fact that Danny did play pretty darn recently will stand to that. Now, the big thing, I think, when it comes to Briere, and we'll pivot to Briere and talk about the whole thing in just a moment, but, Briere is a guy that has always presented himself very professionally, very, as a guy that is, a good human being and, very respectful. But make no mistake about it. This is very important. Danny Briere is a killer when it comes to being competitive. So while he may be the sheep, what's the old saying? Sheep and wool in sheep's clothing or something.
In sheep's clothing.
Yeah. So, I mean, he may be that guy that, you think you're going to get one over on him, but he is really competitive, and he is a guy that will compete and do whatever it takes to be successful. Was that way as a player, and I imagine that's going to translate into that way as a general manager.
Oh, I'd say for sure. I mean, that competitiveness, and Danny's ambitious too. Danny is, Danny both as a player and so far in his managerial career, he's always set his sights very high. So, the lack of, everybody lacks experience initially, right? So, and again, he's going to be judged and deserves to be judged on the merits of what he does. We can sit here and talk about we're optimistic, or people that flips, we're pessimistic, same old, and to me it ultimately means nothing. He'll be judged by the merits of what he does. In terms of the personality qualifications, yeah, I mean Danny, anybody's ever met Danny, any context, he's a gentlemanly guy, very approachable, and all of that too. But he wants to win, and that's always been the case. When he played, nobody ever underestimated him twice. He had a number of suspensions in his career because of his level of competitiveness. He knew how to create space for himself on the ice, and I suspect that as he gains experience doing this too, he'll know how to deal with other GMs, which guys he can trust, which guys are trying to get one over on him. It's all part of the job and part of trying to succeed in the NHL. I mean, it's a very competitive dog-eat-dog business. It just is. I don't think Danny's uncomfortable in that realm.
Brian, one of the things you see quite a bit of is, here the Flyers go again, hiring another former Flyer. Now, the last couple of regimes, well, I mean, Ron Hextall obviously was a former Flyer, but Chuck Fletcher was not a former Flyer. Last bunch of coaches. When you go back to Dave Haxtell, obviously, you go back to Alain Vigneault, and you go now to John Tortorella, no former Flyer ties. But obviously, Danny Briere has didn't finish his career here, but played some really important years here. And he's a guy that, like you said, knows the lay of the land, as does Keith Jones. But this is kind of going back a little bit to, having guys that are involved in the organization. And that's not exclusive to Philadelphia. That happens in all sports leagues. I mean, when you look at the list of GMs, like I mentioned before, I look at Rob Blake, who played in Los Angeles. I look at guys like Chris Drury, who were a Ranger. I look at Mike Greer. He was a San Jose Shark. A lot of guys, a person's competitive, what their makeup is, if they were a member of your organization. And that's always going to be a feather in their cap when they're trying to get a position like this.
It happens in every walk of life. I mean, every non-sports business, you've got people that are running a business because they started there when they were younger or something like that. For me, when I look at the former player status of these two guys, to me it is really just almost happenstance, if you will, because if you look at their stats, obviously Danny Briere known for his playoff runs, but regular season played 364 games for the Flyers, played 609 games for 4 other teams. In Jonesy's case, 131 games here, 360 games elsewhere, and then embarking on a 23-year television career where he's obviously mostly covering Flyers games, but he's not a Flyers employee. So the majority of their careers has included exposure to other organizations is what it comes down to for me. The connection that they have here is that both of them played here at times when the Flyers were, one of the top teams in the National Hockey League. Obviously, they both played, in times when the Flyers were at the Eastern Conference Final level or better than that. And so they were, in the situation that a lot of folks have grown accustomed to of being one of the teams to beat in the NHL on the ice, but also one of the marquee franchises off the ice. I mean, for so many years, the Flyers on the business side were the model for other teams around the NHL. So they know where this team has been in the past. And as far as looking to the past, that the only thing they want to do is to get them back to that status of a marquee franchise. They both come into the jobs with completely new ideas, fresh ideas of how to do it. And those ideas I expect are going to be along the lines of the current reality of the NHL and what you need to do to succeed in this league. You've got to, again, deal with a salary cap that we both know the Flyers did not enter the salary cap era well. They did not enter the new rules era well with the elimination of the clutching and grabbing and physical play. And, again, a lot of that had to do with management that was connected to that old type of play. But that's not what these guys are. They're not connected to that old type of play, especially in Danny's case, his most successful years. He's one of the guys that the new rules in 2005 just completely revitalized his career and sent him on to what he was able to do. So, these are guys that are well versed in the current ways that teams get to be successful. That's, developing your prospects, developing your draft picks, finding guys to contribute significantly at middle salary ranges and not leaning too hard on the stars and stuff like that. They come in with familiarity with the Flyers' history, but I think both of them have a completely different idea of how to approach it.
Bill, when it comes to Keith Jones, he played in Philadelphia. He didn't play here a tremendously long time. Had the knee injuries that ended his career early. But as soon as he retired, he did something very interesting. He was trying to figure out what he was going to do next. And, when you just get off the ice, you don't have people knocking down your door, to do some kind of media job. You have to kind of earn it. And I think for 2+ years, I was at WIP at the time, he started coming in with Angelo Cataldi in the morning show there. He didn't get paid for 2+ years. He had to come in and prove his worth that, he could come in and be an asset to the radio station. And he grinded, didn't get paid, and did that and turned that into a career. And then obviously started doing some pre and post game live stuff on NBC Sports Philly, Comcast Sportsnet at the time, and became obviously, got involved with Versus when they got the NHL rights all the way to NBC and then TNT. But he's a guy that's very well respected around the league from, whenever he's doing games nationally or the Flyers are in City X or Colorado, Joe Sakic's grabbing him to talk to him about players and stuff like that. Talk about the respect level that he has around the NHL and how that can be a beneficial element of this.
Oh, for sure. I remember a couple of years ago, Dallas Stars came in, and first person Jim Nill went and talked to was Jonesy. And it's that way around the league, as you said. I mean, he's a very, very respected figure around the league, in part because he doesn't sugarcoat stuff.
He's authentic.
It's funny as Jonesy can be, and he has a great sense of humor. Just very quick. But the flip side of that too is that if he has an opinion on something and he's in position to present that opinion, he gives it to you straightforward. And I think that's part of why he's so respected around the game. I mean, he's taken the Flyers to task any number of times on the air, whether it's within a game or whether it's within a national broadcast, and he has something to say, he says it. And I think that's admirable, and it's part of why he has a respect factor that he holds. And also as much as Jonesy likes to go, I don't prepare, I just wing it. Jonesy's well prepared.
Yeah.
He knows what's going on.
Yeah, that's baloney. I'm like, dude, you're like one of the smartest hockey guys I ever hear. Where the stuff you see when you watch the game and all of that. He's got a little bit of old school in him, Bri. Yeah, I mean, he's got, he's not, the most progressive guy when it comes to the game. He believes it should be played a certain way. Danny's a little more analytically driven, and having all of those different elements. I mean, they have a big analytics department headed by Ian Anderson. They're all a piece of it. I don't think you can be any one of those things in today's NHL. You can't be all analytics and you can't be all eye test old school, but you have to be a combination of all of those things. And that has to be an element of this going forward too.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And, the people are still trying to figure out exactly, I think, where analytics fits into everything here, because the silver bullet to me hasn't been found. If it had, everybody would be doing it. And everybody's so protective of what they do internally that that they don't want it to get out if they find it. But to me, the biggest example that jumps out to me as far as what kind of manager I think Danny is going to be is you can read about it in the Inquirer if you do a Google search. His deep dive into analytics with Ian Anderson, the head of the department here, and Travis Konechny. They took a long, hard look at TK's game and broke down some things for him using analytical models, and he gives it great credit for his bounce back year this year. I see that expanding. I mean, there's no reason it wouldn't to go to other guys around the room. And again, for me, when you're looking at analytics, it's like it's part of the bigger picture, like you said. You're not going to have a whole team of guys that are analytically at the top of the league in all these different categories. You're going to have complementary parts, just like you do, fourth liners, third liners, and then your top six. And so it's really, to me, about they're going to use that as a tool to develop the strengths of various players. Because again, not every player is a power right winger. Not every player is a defensively sound defenseman. Not every player is a jump into the rush defenseman. But they're going to use those kind of tools to bring out the strong points in everybody's individual game and use that to mesh it together in the bigger picture. That's kind of where I see this going. And that's what I see as Danny Briere, the GM. I don't see him as, going back and making the Flyers tough to play against and, bringing in all these gritty guys or whatever that everybody always criticizes the past for. I think it's moving forward, and it's going to start moving forward rapidly here.
Now, the other components of this, Bill, are, everybody's got to be working and pulling on the rope in the same direction, to use an old tired cliche. And, that goes to the business side as well, headed by Valerie Camillo. Everyone will report to Dan Hilferty, who I think was a really big part of this process. But let's bring in the element of John Tortorella. A lot of people made some assumptions, Bill, in this offseason that Torts, because he was upstairs and having his assistants coach some games late, that he was angling to move upstairs for the president of hockey operations position. I asked him about that point blank on Flyers Daily, and he said, no, I am not going into management. He still enjoys the coaching and the teaching and everything that comes with it. And I think there's a huge level of investment in what's going on here in Philadelphia. Maybe he's involved in a different way than he's ever been at any other job when it comes to the construction of this roster. How do those three, Tortorella, they call this the triumvirate. Dan Hilferty has called it the triumvirate. How does Tortorella, Keith Jones, and Danny Briere work in concert to get the most out of every element of this rebuild?
I think there have been now, of course, Jonesy's kind of new to this part of it too, but I think there have been hints as to how some of it may work. And I think over the over the course of the year, over the course of the first year, one thing that Torts was in a lot of even before the GM change was made, but they were always providing each other with feedback. I think when you look at the past 10 years, right? Dave Haxtell's one and only job was coach of the roster that Hexy gave him.
Coach, what I give you?
Yeah, and he didn't pick his own assistant coaches. It was the roster and the staff he was given, and was happy to work with it. And George certainly had a lot of say in his assistant coaches. He's had a lot of say as how he feels as the roster as to who should be part of it going forward. And one of the things that listen, Torts talks with people he trusts. And so I know he's had a lot of conversations with Jonesy, for example, and he had a conversation with Danny even before the changeover. I think one of the things that as they work together a little bit, I think Danny provided feedback from having worked really on the ice with some of these guys. You know, and when Torch felt that he was being told one thing and he wasn't seeing it on the ice, I mean, he's flat out said it. You know, I mean, I'll give an example. Give an example. Certain players, you know, he talked about how he heard one thing about this guy, and he didn't see it on the ice. And you know, and sometimes the young guys. Sometimes it was the young guys. You know, I think, you know, a guy like Tanner Lazinski, for example, kind of got in towards his doghouse a little bit over the course of the year, and Torch said, well, you know, I'm told that he can do this and that, but I'm not seeing it, right? Early in the year, he was saying that about Morgan Frost, and apparently he got feedback. We need a little more patience here, right? Keep with it. And then he saw it over the second half of the season. So I think that when there is that rapport and that trust is built up, that's you know, that's kind of how I see the relationship working. You know, Torts has his method of coaching, and I mean, ultimately, Danny Briere is going to get the final say on personnel decisions, but there's going to be a lot of back and forth discussion.
Yeah,
and Jones will be part of that.
And to that point too, Bill, I think one thing we've seen in the last 4 hours here, or even leading into the hire, they're going to bring in a president of hockey operations with GM experience to help Danny. And I honestly think that what we're going to end up seeing is if there is going to be any help provided to Danny in terms of how to structure the roster, it's actually going to come more from John Tortorella. And I think that might be a new thing. A part of what this new structure is going to be is the coach, you know, having more of a say. We've seen GM coaches before, but not in a very long time in the league. But I think he's going to be offering a lot of input as to what he thinks the roster should be, rather than it coming downward from the president, which, you know, I'm sure Jonesy will have some things to say, but it's going to come up from Tortorella as well. And I see no problem with that. I think that's actually maybe a good way to do it, because you're talking to the guy that's down there on the bench every game. The one thing about it, I had to laugh when people were thinking Torts was trying to become the president or something. It's, you know, it was apparently not quite as apparent as it was to us how much he hated being up there. I mean, he couldn't stand it. If he wasn't talking to Danny upstairs, he'd just stay downstairs in his office. So, I mean, it was very, you know, kind of out of his comfort zone for him to be up there with us. So, you know, I think that's going to be part of how this ends up being structured. And then when it comes to the rest of the stuff that the GM does, I've seen a lot of people, does he know how to manage the salary cap? Well, here anyway, Barry Hanrahan manages the salary cap. He's done that for years under, I don't know, several different GMs at this point. You know, so you know, most teams have capologists, if you will, like that, that manage the cap, because it's its own job trying to figure out where you're going and stuff like that. And then, you know, on the drafting and development side, that's where Brent Flair's specialty is. So, you know, he doesn't necessarily need to be the expert at everything. He's either got staff here already that is going to, you know, continue in helping in those roles, or if there's a spot where they identify that he wants a little bit more support, then they'll hire somebody to do that. So, you know, that's kind of where this is headed.
Yeah, and the cap guy is at the behest of the general manager. You
Sure.
know, the cap guy's not saying, hey, let's pay this guy X amount of dollars for X amount of years. The cap guy's putting the structure of the contract together, how the you know, whatever the contract is, how that money's allocated, how much of it's signing bonus, how much is in each year, all of those things. You know, so you know, it's interesting in team building today because you have several different ways to do it. You look at teams like Toronto, or you look at teams like Edmonton with superstar players that are paying a small group of players a huge percentage of their cap. And then you have other teams like the Boston Bruins, who aren't going to be paying Pastrnak a ton of money, but traditionally have not paid any individual player monstrous amounts of cash, or the Carolina Hurricanes, where they have a player over $7.2 million, I believe. And you look at them and their depth. To find out what Danny Briere's philosophy will be on team building when it comes to those things, I think is going to be really interesting. You know, some teams like just didn't give out long-term contracts. I think San Jose was one of those teams that never gave big term. to players until they acquired Erik Karlsson. And it was kind of a shock that they did what they did because it was out of their character. What will the character be of Danny Briere is a big question, and what his core beliefs are on how to build a team, both on the ice and off the ice from a financial standpoint, Bill.
And I think also part and parcel to that is not just how you allocate the cap, but also how you allocate contracts. You have the 50 contract limit, except for guys who can slide. I think we're already seeing signs that they're trying to be more judicious in how they allocate those 50 contracts. So I think you're going to see some of that in terms of guys who get qualifying offers and who don't, and also in terms of prospects who you think, well, maybe they won't play in the NHL. If you see them more as an AHL guy, typically a lot of those guys have gotten contracts, they've gotten entry-level deals because maybe they might play a secondary role in the future. And when you get burned a few times and you end up with college free agents out there, for example, that you think might be able to play, and now you're already allocated out to 50, and then you can't be in that game. So I think already there's been some steps talked about in that direction, and I would not be surprised if the Flyers going forward are pretty judicious in who they sign, who they don't sign, for depth purposes.
Yeah, and with this new triumvirate, Bry, with Keith Jones, Danny Briere, and John Tortorella, I mean, the longest tenured guy in their position is John Tortorella, who has been here maybe a calendar year total. This offseason is really pivotal, not in the sense that they're going out there and going big price tag, big name shopping, but there's some, as Torts has referred to it, some subtraction that needs to take place first. And you don't just, this isn't the NFL where you just say, hey, we don't want this guy anymore. We just cut him. We move on. There's no obligation financially or anything like that. You got to make trades in this league. Danny Briere making trades for the first time, and pretty significant ones, whether it's, guys, the names that we've heard, Kevin Hayes or Ivan Provorov. You're talking about pretty substantial and very important hockey trades, but he can't get pushed around in the market. He's got to, hold the line and start his reputation as a guy that is not going to be pushed around as a GM, much like he was as a player, yielding that stick down behind the net.
Yeah, and I think that's going to come pretty easily to him, rather naturally, I think, and a lot of it has to do for me with the fact that it's not just like I'm just going to pull this out of thin air, but it's not like when Kyle Dubas comes into the league at age 25 or whatever, 27, with all these seasoned hockey executives. I mean, Danny is coming in here basically at the same time as a lot of his peers are running teams elsewhere in the league. So he's dealing with people that he's familiar with and he's on pretty common ground with. But I do think that you're going to end up seeing some trades that are, like you said, kind of hockey trades that really kind of move the needle a little bit, because I feel like they're going to have to do that in order to do some of the subtraction that John Tortorella wants. I don't think you're just going to be able to go out and say, oh, hey, we don't want this guy anywhere. Let's just trade him for a pick or something like that, because the league has gotten to the point where, things like cap space, all that is used as an asset. So, he doesn't want to go down the road of, that's one of the reasons James Van Riemsdyk stayed here at the deadline, is because the Flyers were going to have to give up assets just to have somebody take them, and that doesn't make any sense. Just keep them at that point. Whether that was a negotiating thing or that's just where the market was, I honestly, obviously don't know. I wasn't in the room, but you want to get to the point where you're not giving away an asset to get rid of a guy for cap space purposes or something like that. So if you see one of these, relatively blockbuster moves come together where it's, a young roster player, but also maybe an older veteran that they want to clear out so a younger player can come in and develop or something like that. That's the kind of thing I think Flyers probably want to angle for this summer in trying to revamp this, because, like you said, it's not like you can just drop a guy and, the cap's only going up by $1 million. The Flyers already have $1.4 million, I think, Bill, in overages, something like that. So, they don't want to have to give up assets to get cap space, but they also got to be judicious with what they have. So, it's definitely going to be an interesting next couple of months. We're here on May 11th. So the Cup final is over in about a month. And then next thing you know, we're right into the draft and stuff. So, in the next 60 days, you're going to see, I think, a lot continue in this quote unquote start of a new era.
Bill, these three guys, this triumvirate of Keith Jones, Danny Briere, and John Tortorella, they have a unique task in a city that is short on patience, rightfully so, and in a city that's not used to the word and gutting out a rebuild. This has been termed a rebuild, and a rebuild is something you cannot microwave. The timeline does flex. You can't put a specific timeline on it because you don't know about the development of players, the health of players, how a guy that you draft 5th overall in Cutter Gauthier or this year 7th overall, whoever that may be, how quickly they may get to and be a key component of a team. You don't know those things. But these three are navigating this rebuild, and you can't pop it in the microwave because when you microwave food, it tastes like microwave food, and that's no good. Today's NHL, microwave food will not pass the test. But being on the same page and being able to communicate that message is important. And I know that has been a frustration of Flyers fans, is that the communication didn't match what was needed or what was being executed.
Sure. And part of a rebuild too, and it's not the pretty part. Sometimes you have to be willing, you might take a step back before you take your next step forward. Flyers showed improvement from the competitiveness side this past year. The record still wasn't anywhere near playoff caliber, largely based upon 2 really tough stretches, November and February being really rough. But, as you're making moves in the offseason with the long term in mind, and I'm thinking here, specifically, you move Ivan Provorov, for example, right? I don't know where you're immediately replacing those minutes. You have a long-term plan in mind. Hopefully, you're hoping to develop and have the wherewithal to do that. But there was a chance that the Flyers could take the record could take a step backward this year because, they'll backfill as best they can to use a term that John Tortorella has put out there many times. But there's no guarantees. I mean, you're still trying to build for the long term. Hopefully the team takes steps forward, but that's not for sure. I think you have to keep the big picture in mind that it's a multi-year process. And on the flip side, if another year out you surprise and you get a wild card spot, for example, your surprise playoff team, that can't I don't use the word delude, but it can alter your big picture plan. You can't say, okay, now we can go full steam ahead. We're going to go make a big signing, and we're there. You're still trying to build consistency and identity and whatever. And I think you can't let a step up or a step back. You win some overtime games as opposed to a year ago, right? Those are. Then maybe you're looking at a different picture in terms of the standings a little bit, at least. I don't think you can distract it from the big picture. If you take a step back, you take a step forward, it's still, to me, a multi-year process.
Bill, it's not completely linear, is it? Like it's almost like player development. There are ups and downs to a rebuild. Like we saw that in Colorado is a great example of that. They just look like a team that was on the come. They have, guys like Gabriel Landeskog. They have Nathan McKinnon and, a core of players that they're building with the first overall pick in McKinnon. And then all of a sudden 2016-17 happens. Patrick Roy resigns early in the season. They end up with the worst record in the league. They were furious that they landed 4th in that NHL draft lottery after being in the rears, 21 standings points to the second worst team in the league. Hischier goes 1, Nolan Patrick goes 2, and eventually at number 4, Colorado picks the next Bobby Orr and Cale Makar. Yeah. And it all works out, and they end up winning a cup. And Makar, obviously, a huge part of that. But sometimes, what seems like a gift right at the moment turns out to not be a gift. And, what seems like something that you didn't want turns out to be a great savior in a lot of ways.
Sure. And it had to be bold. Makar you always have to be willing to take on a certain element of risk too. I mean, Makar was a junior A defenseman, and everybody, really high upside. He was going to play collegiate hockey. That's why he played junior A to retain his eligibility. But you draft a guy that high who's dominated lower level competition, and is it a guarantee he's able to do the same when he moves up? No, it really isn't. There's plenty of examples of guys who dominated lower levels and then couldn't translate to higher levels, and then you're Cal Makars who make it look seamless. So you can't be too conservative. You can't be just openly risky. It's really is case to case, player to player. But when you establish a track record that you you show that you've had some success where you can take some risks. I mean, I think that's where the Flyers want to get to. And developmental wise, I think this past year was among the positives this year. I think there were positive steps developmentally from the NHL level to the AHL level to on down from there. Even some guys that were picked in later rounds had surprisingly strong years after they were drafted. But the Flyers have been in that position before where, if you look at the Future Watch issue of the Hockey News, which, I mean, what's always interesting about that to me is it's based upon input from personnel directors, assistant GMs, and they're not rating their own system. They're rating it league-wide, and they have to recuse themselves from rating their own system. If you look back at the late 2010s and very early 2020s, the Flyers were at the top, actually. And it just didn't work out.
Not by their evaluation, by other teams.
By other teams' evaluations, right. The league-wide consensus, I think it was in 2019, was the Flyers are rated number 1, league-wide, best system. And, it just, for whatever reason, guys fall by the wayside, and it did not work out. So the Flyers have kind of ended up back in a bit of a rebuilding phase. You mentioned Colorado. Colorado had that experience, right? They were 2008. They started a rebuild. Matt Duchene was going to be their marquee player.
Yeah.
And, Duchene ended up being a good player, but not a franchise guy. And they go in a few years, had a surprise playoff run. But, 2013, they're drafting McKinnon number 1 overall. And by the way, that was the year where Seth Jones was kind of the consensus number 1 until very shortly before the draft. So, they had McKinnon. They draft Landeskog 2nd overall. Rantanen is a top 10 pick. And as you said, they kind of crashed again. But they stayed the plan in that case. They didn't take the step back like they did previously and make trades and that kind of restart the rebuild. They stuck with it. They had, then they had a piece and off they went. So if there's one, there's no one model to face, but I think you have to know when to be patient and when it's not working and you need to reevaluate. So the Flyers kind of ended up in a reevaluation period and off we are again.
Brian, we'll wrap up in just a couple moments, but in looking and preparing for Flyers Daily after the draft lottery, there's several ways to build a team. You can go full-blown tank like Chicago did, and I know it stings that they win it because they end up getting Patrick Kane, and the Flyers ended up with JVR. That's nothing against JVR. Patrick Kane's going to the Hall of Fame. And you look at Chicago, tanking doesn't have integrity, in my opinion, and they got rewarded for it. I mean, they decimated their roster, traded young guys like DeBrincat and Doc, and obviously Kane during the season, which I totally understand. But good teams and teams with sustainability, I think, no matter where they draft, they find talent. And you look at the Boston Bruins, who get Pasternak 25th overall. They get McAvoy 14th. Yeah, they have a number 1 overall pick in Taylor Hall there. You look at, like I mentioned, Carolina before. Yeah, they took Svechnikov 2nd overall, but Aho 35th. The Tampa Bay Lightning. Yeah, they have Stamkos number 1, Hedman number 2. But you find 58th overall, Nikita Kucherov. 19th overall, Andrei Vasilevsky. In the 3rd round, you get Braden Point. You got to be able to evaluate talent and transferable skills and how that talent's going to develop into a pro and at the pro game, not what they are at the moment. And that's how you can really exploit the draft. We'll see if they're able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, you have to find some of those later round gems. There's certainly no mistaking that. And, a guy like Noah Cates right now may be turning into one of those for the Flyers. We'll see where it goes. But, with respect to Chicago, I mean, again, everybody looks at that and says, oh, they tanked. And they, that's what the Flyers should have done. Well, if you look a little closer at the whole situation, Chicago didn't finish last. They finished third from last. And they won the lottery based on the draw that gave it to the third from last spot. It wasn't like Chicago managed to get the best odds, which is part of the danger of tanking. The situation that Columbus and Anaheim found themselves in, I think, was not necessarily tanking related. But how would you feel if you tanked and you ended up like them right now? You just have, you're still going to get a good player, but you were angling for one guy and you don't get him. Also to your point with Makar, obviously this year is a little different. There's one guy, but how many years do we look back on and redraft, and the best player in the draft is not the guy that was picked first overall? The draft is a little bit of a crapshoot right now.
They're kids.
Yeah, it's still a little bit hard to predict. To your point about Boston, yes, they have Taylor Hall. They didn't draft Taylor Hall there. They traded for him after the fact. They have been able to build what they've got without a ton of these high-level picks. So, again, it is just about having, good eyes out there. This is going back to the old era, but the Red Wings' success came off of finding all these European players in the last 3-4 rounds of the draft. It is about trying and not just drafting these guys, but once you get them here, developing them to their strengths and not trying to make them play a certain way or something like that. And the other thing too that was mentioned at some point this year is that you look for more guys like Owen Tippett, guys that were selected high, need a change of scenery. How many guys have we seen go out of Philly benefiting from a change of scenery and do well in other towns? Flyers need to have some of those guys coming back in. So those are kind of the keys for me to building out this roster.
Oh, I could build a team of 4 lines deep and 3 deep pairs and a couple of goalies that they maybe shipped off too soon. At times,
mm-hmm.
You get that greediness of wanting to win so badly now that you don't want to wait on some guys and you use them to try and bolster your team, whether that was, guys like Patrick Sharp or Justin Williams or, others along the way. But you got to be patient. And, the Edmonton Oilers won 4 draft lotteries in 6 years, 3 in a row. Yeah. They drafted Hall in 10, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins 11, Nail Yakupov in 12, and then obviously McDavid has been a big part of that. That team's won 3 playoff series. That's incredible. Right. That's
again,
they won one this year too.
Yeah, you have to put the pieces around them. If you get all these stars and studs, and you can't defend, that's what happened to them in recent years. Now they've made steps to address that, and they're having some success this year with it now, finally. But again, you can't. We've talked about it too, Jason. Even when you're putting together an Olympic lineup, which is more or less a fantasy draft, you could take the top 20 players and make them into your national team, but that's not necessarily how it works. You take, you kind of
Chris Kunitz.
Yeah, you take your top 6 forwards, and then you go and you look at a different type of forwards for your bottom 6. It's the same way with the D. So, it's about finding. And again, because we're in a cap world, it's about finding these complementary pieces that fit in at hits that allow you to assemble the team. So, it's I haven't done it, but if you go to Cap Friendly and you go and look at Boston's roster or Tampa's roster the last couple of years, just look down at what everybody's making. You've got guys that are making $1 million a year, being major contributors to those teams. Yeah,
no doubt. Last thing, and we'll go to you, Bill. You get the final word here on this special edition of Flyers Daily that we're live streaming. Tomorrow, this is the press conferences. It's going to be a large dais tomorrow. Dan Hilferty will be there. Valerie Camillo will be there. Keith Jones, the new president of hockey operations, will be there. Danny Briere will be there. And John Tortorella will be there. what's important for you to hear tomorrow at that press conference? What's going to be the big takeaway that you need to hear?
Well, I would say it's two things, and Brian alluded to some of it earlier. I'd like a little bit more clarity on exactly what the president of hockey ops scope is going to be. We talked a little bit about the communication side of it, but what are the specific duties that are going to be included in what Jonesy's doing? And the other part of it too is, okay, we had this. What are our next steps? Danny now has the interim tag removed. And obviously he's not going to be able to name names, but you can't accomplish everything in one off season. But I'd like to know, okay, now that we know who the GM is and we know who the president of hockey ops is, what are the immediate next steps of focus? Obviously the draft is a piece of it, but where are you looking to go in terms of prioritizing this off season?
Yeah, I think those are two good things. How is Keith Jones' performance judged? What are the responsibilities is a big thing. And then the other thing too is, we all want transparency. Who are you going to trade? What are you going to do? Who are you trying to get? Right. GMs aren't going to say that stuff publicly. First of all, they're never going to criticize one of their own players and devalue them publicly. And then they're never going to tip their hand publicly either. So while I get we all want transparency, it's better to not get transparency. We can demand transparency in method and what the plan is per se, but the specifics we likely will never get. Great stuff, guys. Appreciate it on this special edition of Flyers Daily. Read Bill Meltzer's stuff at PhiladelphiaFlyers.com, NHL.com, HockeyBuzz.com. Brian Smith now writing as well on PhiladelphiaFlyers.com. So we got tons of stuff coming. So make sure you check out the website. We'll be back Monday. We'll have another Monday with Meltzer coming up in just a couple of days' time. We'll kind of talk about the press conference, what we heard, what we liked, and much more. So thanks for listening, everybody. We appreciate it. This has been a special edition of the Flyers Daily podcast. We'll talk to you Monday on a brand new episode of Flyers Daily.